Hello, my name is Kyron Brooks, and this past June, summer of 2018, I had the amazing opportunity to study abroad in Cuba for 2 weeks. Cuba was an experience like no other. Words will never be able to authentically capture what I saw, my roller coaster of emotions, and how I'm impacted. This multimedia journal is a reflection of those moments and highlights my major overall theme, culture. The four major aspects of Cuban culture that amaze me most, which you will see throughout the journal, are social life and community, buildings and architecture, food, and cars. Hope you enjoy. Time to get started. Okay, so Cuban culture is my overall theme, and below are the table of contents for it. I broke up the overall theme of culture into four categories listed here on this slide. Every one of these images presented in this journal is a part of Cuban culture, from places like Fabrica de Arte to the lack of seasoned food I consumed. Whatever the image is, Cuba would not be Cuba without it. The first category that I'm going to focus on is social life and community. Community is a key component of their everyday lives, and though much of it has to do with political structure and values, I appreciate how Cuba embraces unity and collaboration, whereas America is more individualistic and thrives on competition. America has lost that sense of community, and we replaced it with other forms of easy communication like Facebook and Instagram. However, in Cuba, the family unit. Pictured here is the beautiful community center we visited for our community engagement project. I had a good time learning about all of the wonderful contributions the staff makes to benefit the Cuban people. The hosts go to incredible lengths to preserve their cultural heritage and to raise their communities to even greater heights. The art around the center was incredible and was created by Cuban artists in many different mediums for an eclectic and vibrant look. Our guide explained that the cultural center was used for community classes and workshops for children. Here is a picture of me talking to a man that I met on my way home from lunch one day. On my walks back to our study center from lunch, I enjoyed looking around my local neighborhood and just reveling in my surroundings, seeing the beauty of Cuba. Most days in the beginning, I didn't really have an opportunity to do that because I was so distracted by the heat and the humidity. But towards the second week, I kind of stopped to just enjoy the scenery and actually look around. On this particular day, my group and I, we finished eating lunch early, so we decided to pause and just sit for a while. And that's when the man, as you see in the picture, he came up to sit right next to me, and we just had like a lighthearted conversation about food, Cuba, and we just kind of talked about what we were doing for the day, and he asked about our program. And this was just a really great memory for me because I actually got to talk with someone who was from the local neighborhood, and I just really had a good time just enjoying my post lunch walk. When thinking about the aspects of Cuban culture, specifically social life and community, I knew that I had to include this picture, and although it may seem simple, it just represents my time in Cuba, particularly at Fabrica de Arte, which was one of my favorite places to go. And I think it was one of my favorite places because at Fabrica, I didn't feel like an American or an outsider. I just felt like I was part of a community that just loved to celebrate, loved to dance, loved music, loved yelling out lyrics to the top of their lungs. And that's how I always felt at Fabrica. I always met cool people there, whether they were from New York or from Cuba or from Philly or the Philippines. It was just always a blend of cultures. And I feel like Cuba just welcomes everyone so much that I didn't feel like, oh, I don't fit in or this isn't my neighborhood. It was just we met these two guys. They were really nice. We danced with them all night. We had a great time. They were in all of our pictures and our videos, and we just sung the lyrics to songs that we all loved, American songs. There were some Cuban songs, and we just really had a great time. The social life in Cuba is immersed in traditional Cuban culture of music and dance. I got a chance to experience this at the jazz club just down the street from where I live, the Afro-Cuban Religion and Art Space, as well as the community center where we completed our service project. My host mother explained that Cuba is known for their extraordinary ballet and home to the world's biggest ballet school, the Cuban National Ballet School. But its most popular dance styles have deep roots in native soil, ultimately spreading far beyond the Havana is one of the most architecturally diverse cities in the world. I cannot resist taking nonstop photos of some of the city's most weathered and colorful buildings. Its buildings clearly mirror its social and political history ever since the Spanish colonial times, up to the more modern present day. And one of the interesting facts that I learned on my trip is that some of Havana's buildings are run down because someone always has to fix them, which means that person is guaranteed a job. So it keeps the One of the most distinct features of Cuba's architecture is how close units are to each other, which made it somewhat difficult to spot out some lunch spots such as 3D Cafe. The restaurant where we had group lunch is towards the bottom middle of the photograph with the red and white stripes. These two buildings to me represented the more modern type of Cuban architecture. The picture to the left was taken in Old Havana, and I kept walking past this picture every time I traveled there, and I just kept thinking I have to take a picture, and I finally did, and I just loved the color combination with the yellow and the blue. It was really pretty to me. And then the picture to the right was taken at our folklore dance workshop, and I just, again, like the I'm actually unsure of the significance of the first building to the right. I took it mainly because of the structure aesthetic. However, the buildings to the left are significant because education and allegiance to the country are top priorities in Cuba. The first image is of the University of Havana, and the second image below is Cuba's Capitol building. Havana architecture actually has a number of American influences, and this is true of a number of government buildings that were constructed prior to the Cuban Revolution, but most notably the Cuban Capitol. These two photos were taken in my local neighborhood. The picture to the left was taken right in front of Cafe de la Esquina, one of my favorite restaurants while I was in Cuba. And the picture to the right either was by my house or by our study center. I can't remember which one, but it was in one of the neighborhoods. And I just really like these
Both
two
of these
pictures
photos were
because of
taken
the
around my local
colors
neighborhood.
and
The picture to the
just
left
how they're
was
completely
taken right in
different
front of my
yet
favorite
both beautiful and
restaurant, Cafe
represent
de la
the
Esquina.
architecture
And the
culture
picture
in
to the
Cuba.
right, I can't remember if it was in my neighborhood where I lived or around the study center. But either way, I chose both of these photos because
the Cuban Institute for Friendship with Peoples, otherwise known as ICAP, is a social organization officially constituted in 1960 with the purpose of promoting and explaining to the peoples of the world the relations of solidarity that sparked the Cuban Revolution. ICAP is the vehicle to reach around the globe to people who are in solidarity with Cuba. It represents the Cuban people and delivers a strong message that solidarity not only benefits Cuba, but the others of the world who are aspiring to promote the The third category that I included in my multimedia journal is food. I chose to include food to represent an aspect of Cuban culture because it's very different from American food and all of our different flavors and variety. The staples are beans and rice, so Cuban beans and rice, most likely because it's cheap and it can sustain people, it can sustain a family. Meat is also a staple, so we ate a lot of chicken and pork. Those two meats were huge. I ate that a lot in my homestay and in restaurants. And also pizza. Pizza is very different. I didn't really care for it, but I noticed that the ingredients for the pizza kind of remained the same at each restaurant that I went to, and I kind of consider that a staple for Cuban culture as well. This meal was one of the first few meals that I actually had in Cuba. I realized that this would be what a typical meal in Cuba consisted of: rice, beans, and chicken. And I realized that that's a main food staple. And as you'll see in the images to follow, these food options are included almost on every menu in every restaurant that I visited, with a few exceptions of some, which you'll also see. And one of the most fascinating things that I learned from my host mom is that the products in Cuba are rationed. So they have a little mini book with a list of products that they obtain for the month and then the amount that they can receive. And they go to the store and pick out those products for their families. And I also noticed that we typically had rice and beans with some type of meat each night in my homestay. And I think this is most likely due to the affordability of rice and beans along with its easy access to purchase. And not to mention, it fills you up really quickly. I included this image because it represents much of the food I ate while in Cuba. While I did have a few meals that I thoroughly enjoyed, this was not really one of them. It was very unseasoned, the chicken was dry, and I was disheartened to see that the meal was not served with beans. Although I didn't enjoy this meal, it made me appreciate the wide variety and different flavors of food that Americans have right at our fingertips. My experience dining at 3D Cafe was memorable to say the least. While some of the waiters were patient and accommodating, like my table's waiter, the other employees of 3D Cafe were becoming aggravated with our large group. I think a lot of it also had to do with the language barriers and us as Americans being particular about our food, such as wanting substitutions or complaining about the slow service. And this moment for me was a big cultural shock because I just saw the differences in how service is in America compared to service in restaurants abroad. These were just a few alternatives to the typical food I consumed. However, I would have preferred to stick to the traditional rice and beans with chicken because, as my Spelman sisters suggested, you can't go wrong with rice and beans. The chicken tenders and fries I bought at Malia Cohiba Hotel, and they weren't bad, but it wasn't seasoned enough, much like most of Cuban food. The pizza displayed in the middle was purchased in Old Havana, and I did not like it at all. Pizza in Cuba is completely different from pizza in the United States, which I learned multiple times during my 2 weeks. The last image is the good old classic Cuban sandwich. How could I go to Cuba and not get a Cuban sandwich? Although these were my least favorite meals, it again reminded me of the striking differences between Cuba's culture and cuisine and America's food consumption. Much of Cuba's cuisine was also impacted by trade restrictions imposed on Cuba, thus creating food shortages. These next two slides are pictures of the food that I loved the most during my time in Cuba. The pasta and the salad was from the delicious restaurant HM7. These were really the only meals I thoroughly enjoyed, in addition to the dessert we had for the farewell dinner. My taste buds loved these meals, most likely because it was the closest thing to American food, which I craved nearly the entire time in Cuba. However, many Cubans do not eat at places like HM7 due to the high cost. For example, my pasta was 17 CUC compared to my other lunches, which ranged from about 5 to 10 CUC. This food came as another culture shock to me because I didn't discover this restaurant until my last few days in Cuba, and it was so unfamiliar to me. Eating seafood pasta instead of rice and beans, yes, please. When compiling the pictures for the food category of my journal, I knew that I had to include these three pictures because they were all taken at my homestay, and my homestay was a very important part of my trip to Cuba. It was important to include because my homestay was a direct connection I had to Cuban culture, and I ate like an actual Cuban. My host mother made the best mango juice, which is another staple of Cuban culture that I fell in love with the very first day. And similar to America, we also enjoyed pizza and soda for my host mom's birthday celebration, which is pictured in the middle. And then the last picture to the right is just a basic meal that we had. It included rice, chicken, and vegetables. So in this case, the vegetable was string beans. This is a meal that my host mother prepared for us one night, and I felt it was important to include because it represents authentic Cuban cuisine, although it isn't the rice and beans staple. It's pizza and pasta, but I want to specifically focus on the right side of the photograph, which is a fruit called mamey. I think that's how you pronounce it. But it comes from a species of a tree native to Cuba and Central America, and it ranges from southern Cuba to southern Here are just a few of my favorite drinks that I consumed while I was in Cuba. To the far right is the Limonada Frappe, which was included on most menus, actually, throughout my time in Cuba when I went out to eat. The middle picture is of the delicious vanilla milkshake from the Malia Cohiba Hotel. I loved it so much. It was 4 CC, which is pretty expensive, but it was definitely worth it. And the last picture is the Ciego Montero Refresco, which one of the first things that come to mind when I think of Cuba is cars. Cuba is known for their beautiful automobiles, and I was looking forward to riding in one at least once during my time there. Due to the U.S. embargo and Castro's ban of the importation of American cars and mechanical parts, the country lacks the necessary tools for fixing the vehicles, but I realize that the locals are extremely crafty in their repairs. Cuban ingenuity has kept these old American cars on the road, which reminds me of something that our tour guide Alvin once shared. Alvin said to us that Cubans will find a way to fix anything, and I believe the way they take care of their cars is a testimony to that and the mindset of Cuban people. And the cars are just such a vital aspect of Cuban culture. Here we have it. I fulfilled my travel bucket list of taking a tour of Havana in a classic car. In touristy areas like Old Havana and Veradero, there are usually rows of beautiful cars lined up for visitors like us to choose from. Many of the cars are convertibles, which are perfect for cruising and taking pictures. And traveling in a taxi also offered us another interesting look into classic car culture in Cuba. I just decided to throw this picture in here because once again it represents the beautiful car culture in Cuba, and I had finally got a picture in front of a car. This slide is just another depiction of the classic car culture in Cuba. All the different colors, styles, makes, models, all of that. Even the taxis were super cool, and most of the cars are kept in pretty good condition. This is a picture of my kid and I enjoying our last night in Cuba. We took this picture right after our group's final attempt to get a picture in front of the line of cars in Havana. And typically, you can normally find a line of cars in Havana's most touristy spots, such as Old Havana or in Central Havana near historic landmarks. This category differs from all the others in a sense that it serves like an honorable mention to highlight some of my favorite memories while in Cuba. These are just a few of my favorite pictures I took while in awe of Cuba's most beautiful scenery. This image was taken on top of a hill overlooking the highway. Our group had stopped on our way back from Matanzas, and Alvin suggested that we check out this amazing view. This was taken in Casa de Africa in Old Havana, or otherwise known as the House of Africa. During our time there, they had the Nelson Mandela featured exhibit, and it was interesting to see the connection of Afro-Cubans in Havana and experience some of the stories told and represented in the exhibit. I know we had a lot of conversations about this in class regarding the identities and acknowledgement of Afro-Cubans, so going to the House of Africa was a little piece of learning about Afro-Cubanism, although we still didn't receive a lot of information about their presence in Cuba throughout the trip. But nevertheless, it was still a vital aspect of Cuban culture and their rich history, and I really enjoyed the Nelson Mandela exhibit. This officially concludes my multimedia reflection journal. I had a wonderful time in Cuba, and if given the opportunity, I would love to go again, maybe next time on a cruise. But nevertheless, I had a wonderful time, and I hope this journal is a reflection of all the amazing aspects of Cuban culture. Thanks for viewing.